Of course, this is something that Ivan would never understand, and yet it's a very eloquent statement of the Christian idea, or for that matter about the religious idea, about prayer. And then, to my mind, one of the most moving characters in the tale is the old-timer, a prisoner who served several terms and has absolutely no hope of getting out. They give him a 10-year term, he serves it, and then they put on another 10-year term. He serves that, they put on another 10-year term. He knows that he's there for life, but he refuses to let them dehumanize him. The camps are set up in many, many different ways to dehumanize human beings, with bad food, with harsh treatment, with arbitrary punishments, printing numbers on their jackets and referring to them only by number and not by name. There are hundreds of different ways of trying to get them to be no longer human beings, but rather automatons or even animals subject to discipline in the camp. But this man will not give in to that. He sits ramrod straight at the table. Mind you, the kind of food they're getting is terrible, but he would never consider putting even this terrible food on the dirty table. He has a specially washed rag to set under the utensils, and he sits in a particular way that you know that nobody will ever make anything of him other than a human being. That the attempt at dehumanization simply will not work on a certain kind of Russian, on a certain kind of person in the camp, and the admiration is tremendous. Then there is Churin, the gang boss, who's responsible for the rations the men actually get. You understand that they get rations, even of the terribly thin gruel that they're served. They only get the amount of gruel that's proportional to the amount of work that they got done. The more work they get done the day, presumably, the more food they get. And of course, if they don't do the work that's assigned to them, then they get practically no food. So it's tremendously important that Churin, first of all, see to it that at least some work is done. And in the second place, he turns in the bookkeeping in such a way that they get the maximum possible food at that time. Creative bookkeeping has no secrets from him. He had been thrown out of the Red Army when the authorities discovered that although he claimed to come from a working-class background, he had actually come from a middle-class bourgeois background. And when he tells this story in the middle of the tale while the men are working and taking a rest at noon, it's a very, very moving story. His transportation back to Moscow is saved by some women who allow him to hide in the compartment when they're traveling on the train so the conductor won't find him and see that he has no ticket. Later on, some of those women are arrested, and he has a chance to help them out in the camps. There's something very moving and very touching about Churin. These and many other characters come alive through Ivan's untutored observation. Their various views of the world and of Soviet reality come through without any argument or discussion. Ivan is in no position to argue them. Solzhenitsyn makes us believe that we're right there beside them. No amount of attempted dehumanization, no amount of pressure from any direction can take away their colorful individuality. Now, what impressed Khrushchev the most deeply, and it really is a powerful part of the story, is Ivan's devotion to his work on the camp's construction project. Now, we can't forget that he's working on a building which will be a part of a prison to confine him and others like him. As he actually works enthusiastically and hard on a building which will be his own prison, or if not his own prison, the prison of other people exactly like him. This doesn't seem to enter his consciousness. He simply gives all of his attention and effort to laying bricks properly when the Siberian cold is so intense that it freezes the mortar almost before he can apply it to the wall. Imagine trying to put mortar, which after all requires being in a kind of a liquid state, in the temperature in Siberia, where if you leave it out for 15 or 20 minutes, it'll freeze solid and be concrete, of course, until the weather thaws and then fall apart, crumble apart. In order to keep the construction shack warm, they had to improvise some kind of covering for the windows to keep out the cold. Ivan and one of his fellow prisoners decide to snatch a roll of heavy felt from piles belonging to another gang. With great dexterity and boldness, they manage to make the heist and bring the roll of felt, kept vertical between them as if it were somebody walking between them, back to the shack. Later on, when they're out working in the cold, a man from the camp administration, a man named Jer, discovers their larceny and threatens to inform on them. He goes up and he sees these men working, and of course he tries to act as if he were some kind of a boss, and then he says to Churin, the gang boss, "Churin, how did you get that felt? Well, I know that you stole that felt. I'm going to report on you, and when I report on you, boy, it's going to go bad with you." And as he says this, he suddenly realized he's surrounded by prisoners wielding heavy shovels. And it's clear that if he opens his dirty mouth, what they're going to do to him if he plays the snitching game. He gets the message very fast. And we understand how the prisoners knew well the importance of solidarity in the midst of their suffering. I must say, seldom does poetic justice taste so sweet as it does in this scene. Dier, of course, is someone who tries to build himself up at the price of dehumanization of other human beings. And you see that even under the circumstances of the camp, the men know how to get their own back. The men know how to build a universe in which they can live as human beings, and as I said before, not as animals. When the actual bricklaying gets started, Ivan finds himself totally absorbed. It seems safe to me to assume that most readers are not professional layers of brick. Yet the details of the process become almost immediately clear. We identify with the form and the shape of those bricks. We identify with what it means to carry that weight up a ladder when things are frozen, when your foot slips. We identify what it means, in the first place, to get the brick in the proper horizontal position, and to get the mortar on neither too thick, because if he puts it on too thick, it's going to freeze and then crumble. If he puts it on too thin, it's not going to hold the brick at all. He has to put it on just right, and Ivan has mastered the art of just exactly how much mortar is necessary for each brick, and he's mastered the art of getting the brick exactly horizontal so the building won't slope or go to the side. Ivan knows what it means to do a good job, and he's determined to do it. The errors and clumsiness of some of his fellow prisoners simply make him find ways of getting around the mess-ups. And he does this so intently that he doesn't even know what time it is. He pays no attention to quitting time. All the others want to throw down the tools and get away as quick as they can, but Ivan is not going to let one bit of mortar go to waste. When he knows it'll freeze, he won't be able to use it the next day. And he secures a particular trowel so he'll have it the next day, and he can't even resist a last knowing look at the work he's just completed. He knows high-quality work when he sees it. As a matter of fact, he then takes that trowel, that very special trowel that he's fashioned out of a piece of metal, and tries to hide it in his pants. When Ivan finally does join the others who are ready to leave the work site, he finds the men and the guards in a huge uproar. A man is missing. The guards are counting the men over and over again, and they're one short. And the guards know very well that if they come back to the camp missing one man, they're going to take that man's place in the camp. And there's real panic among them. They count and count and count again, and they're roaring. It finally turns out that a Bulgarian prisoner had found a warm spot for himself and immediately gone to sleep. And of course he hadn't heard the whistle, the noise that it was time to quit work, so there he was sleeping while the others were trying to get back. Well, of course, they roughly bring him back to the group. The anger of the men all turn against him. They say, "That lousy spy! I don't need a spy like you and me." You understand that they'd been convicted just like Ivan. None of them were really spies. But this guy was a real spy. "I don't mean like you and me, but a real spy. That's so-and-so." And he keeps us waiting in the snow while he's sleeping. The guy was lucky to get off with a blow on his neck by Turin, the gang boss, who, by that gesture, saved the Bulgarian from much worse treatment from the other prisoners. Here again, you see the concern of Turin, the gang boss, for his men, the fact that one could be a human being even under these terrible circumstances. The contrast between Ivan's honest concentration on his work and the phony natures of the accusations about spying only intensifies the central argument of Solzhenitsyn's tale. It's impossible to turn human beings completely away from the best parts of their humanity. It's impossible to make human beings anything less than human beings, or perhaps he's saying anything less than Russian human beings. When the men get back to the camp after the day's work, we see the last hours of the one day mentioned in the title. The men have the one bit of time they can call their own. At the entrance to the camp, guards are waiting to frisk the returning men, and Ivan suddenly remembers that he has a piece of steel that he picked up at the worksite, the steel that he wants to turn into a small knife. But if the guard finds it, he's going to be in terrible trouble. Now, how is he going to get that piece of steel through the guards, who are quite experienced at frisking the men? Well, he cleverly looks. He has the choice of going in one of two or three lines. He goes to the line that's going through the oldest man, a man who's a veteran and who's thoroughly sick of his job. This man is least likely to give him a thorough search. And then he deliberately puts his hand on the other side of the uniform so the man won't look in the place where the steel is hidden, and he manages to get the steel back into the camp. Such are the small victories in the camp. Ivan also manages to pick up a package sent from the outside to one of his fellow prisoners. That means the man will set aside his regular evening gruel for Ivan and give him some food from the package. Ivan thus has had two portions of the gruel, And after supper, he manages to get some tobacco from the Latvian prisoners, and the Latvians also are portrayed as people who are terribly honest and wonderful people to be with. Ivan comments that people from Baltic countries always seem to be good and efficient country. He talks about Alyoshka the Baptist and sees the serenity that Alyosha gains from his faith in God. Ivan is still rather skeptical, but he still is impressed by Alyosha's calm in the midst of the suffering of the camp, and he can't help but admire him for it. In short, Ivan says at the end of the day, well, it's been a good day in the camp. Of course, it has been a good day, but the one discordant note is the face of the former naval captain when the camp administrator comes to take the unfortunate man to the freezing cell, just at the moment when the captain is enjoying a bit of food donated from the package received from the outside. The prisoners try to buck him up, but there's not much that they can say. Yet the story ends on a positive note. Ivan thinks over the events of the day, including the pleasure he took in the work. He'd gotten extra food, he'd successfully brought in the piece of steel, he'd gotten some tobacco. The day in the midst of the terrible camp had been almost happy, and there were over 3,000 such days in his sentence. With such a simple, quiet statement, Solzhenitsyn makes a more eloquent statement about the hideous Stalinist, so-called socialist camps than the loudest and most passionate public denunciations could possibly have done. And he preserves the total humanity of the prisoners. Of course, largely on the basis of this work and its enormous resonance in the world, Solzhenitsyn became a kind of universal celebrity in the 60s and 70s. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, which the Soviet government wouldn't let him travel to the acceptance ceremony, and his voice was heard most strongly when his own government tried to stifle it. He wrote many increasingly open criticisms of Soviet policy in the 1970s, and Andropov, who later became premier of the Soviet Union, at that time was head of the KGB, kept his eye on him. As a matter of fact, on the telephone, he actually told Andropov that he, Solzhenitsyn, was declaring war on the KGB. His fighting troops would be his books, including some still secret manuscripts which he threatened to release abroad at a strategic time. Well, his words became increasingly bold, or perhaps increasingly self-destructive, depending on your point of view. He wrote a marvelous book called The Calf That Butted Its Head Against the Oak Tree, which really well describes life in the USSR at that time and gave a wonderful picture of how it felt to be an intellectual in that most anti-intellectual time and place. But finally came the inevitable arrest. Now you understand, Solzhenitsyn had never been on an airplane before. And they arrested him, they put him in handcuffs and put him on an airplane, and he expected to travel in an easterly direction towards Siberia, and to his amazement, looking at the sun, he realized that he was traveling to the west. Finally, the plane landed in a Swiss airport, I believe it was Zurich, and Solzhenitsyn was unceremoniously thrown out of the plane. He was in exile. The Soviet government obviously thought it unwise either to incarcerate or execute him. And for over 15 years, as you probably know, Solzhenitsyn chose to live in Vermont, where he worked diligently on volumes describing details of the forced labor camps, and then tried to write his version of the history which produced the revolutions of 1917, the turn of the wheel. And to the shock of some Americans, he came out publicly with statements criticizing American foreign politics and deriding what he considered the utterly frivolous nature of American public life, a subject about which he obviously, in the first place, knew very little, and in the second place, made absolutely no attempts to learn whatsoever. Like a good Russian, he was judging many things that he didn't know. Well, after 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, he agreed to return home, and he came back, of course, initially received as a great hero. Sadly, he got his own program on Soviet television, a kind of a talk program, in which he wouldn't let anybody else talk, and people soon grew tired of him. At the present time, people look at Solzhenitsyn as a kind of a has-been, a man from the past. But I can't find it in myself to look at him either at the time as something from the past, or even judge him for some of the light-minded things he said later on when he was talking about things that he didn't know. He was a very powerful man. He says things exactly the way he thinks them. He gets across things which he thinks are moral and proper, and yet his books receive less and less response from the reading public. To me, he harks back to an era when heroism was possible, and he expressed a kind of a heroism that was one out of many millions.